I'd just like to say that I first met this next person in the very first picture that I ever got to do. It was a picture that was done in about 1971, 72, something like that. We then made another picture together, and that was a picture that was made, I guess our next picture together would have been in about 1979. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce to you the nicest tall guy I've ever met in my entire life, Mr. Angus Scrimm.
On the stands any minute now. Well, I am sorry to tell you that I cannot be with you tonight. I am on location. Where the location is, I'm not quite sure. Maybe it is me and my clone is on location. If so, I just hope he's not working for Skate. Well, I had heard, word had filtered down to me that I might be a contender. I didn't believe it then, and I can scarcely believe it now. I've never thought of the characters I play as being vote-getters. But that's the nice thing about this business. You can be as mean and ugly as hell, and the world receives you aiming. I thank the voters. My association with them, with Tony Timpone, Mike Gingold, and Adam Malin, and Laurie Malin, of both Fangoria and Creation Conventions, has been one of the rich pleasures of my recent years. I owe my small celebrity to the kind people who have given me employment. My first job was by a young man who's gone on to great distinction, Curtis Hanson, the Websters and Steve Barnett, Chris Coppola, the bright creative talents at Full Moon and at Roger Corman's Concord, Jim Wynorski, God bless him. I share the Hall of Fame honor with Reg and with the wonderful casts and crews of the Phantasm pictures. And most of all, of course, with a man I consider a magician of filmmaking, without whom there would be no Phantasm, no Tall Man, and no Angus Scrimm, Don Coscarelli. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
This one doesn't scare you. You're already dead.
Okay, let's hear it for the creator of the Phantasm trilogy, Don Coscarelli.
All right, is this thing working? Thanks for the wonderful introduction. I thought we were going to do this as a question and answer, Jody.
Sure.
Well, I really enjoyed it. I had a chance to walk around out in the dealer's room out there. I was looking for some Phantasm memorabilia. Saw some pretty cool Phantasm shirts out there, and I haven't been to a Fangoria convention now since, I think, about 10 years. And before I open it up to questions and answers, I'd just like to say that I've been with the Phantasm family of us have been with Fangoria since the beginning, I think. I think it's been like 15 years. I think the first coverage we had was maybe issue number 2. And I'd just like to thank Tony and Jacobs and Bob Martin before Tony and Michael Gingold and all of the crew for providing a service to the horror genre. I really think that they're the last keepers of the genre. We're finding that the entire genre is under the attack of the dogs of the MPAA and the clowns in Congress, and there's nobody really out there supporting our genre anymore, and the only people we can look to is Tony and his gang. And I would like to just thank them for having me. I know a lot of you have questions about the Phantasm series. After I made the first Phantasm, honestly, I didn't have answers to a lot of the questions, and I've been working that I got from fans. They'd say, you know, gee, what are the spheres? Who is the tall man? What's he doing? And it took me a few years, about 8, to figure some of those out and to attempt a sequel in part 2. Unfortunately, I think in part 2 I didn't really answer the questions sufficiently, and I'm still getting them. So that was one of the reasons for doing part 3. So I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody had anything about the Phantasm series that I could help you with. Sure, you.
Yeah, the planet Tall Man comes from. Which Mullins planet? Is he dying, or just why is he over here just taking people and breaking them out?
Well, unfortunately, that was one of the questions that I really wanted to try to answer in part 3, which you haven't seen yet. And unfortunately, for budgetary reasons, that was one of the questions I couldn't answer. But I'm going to get to that if I ever do another sequel of this. I'd really like to save that one. I'm not going to answer that question because there is a reason why what that planet is and why he goes there. And it's something that Angus and I have patched up as to what, why he would, or exactly what the nature of the planet is. I'd say he doesn't live there. That's all I can tell you. Anything else? Yes.
The one thing I really love about the Phantasm films is the continuity between sequels, and I wonder if 3 picks up right where 2 left off.
Yes, actually, that was, I thought one of the real, the things I was most proud of the second one is how it was like the next minute, you know, it's like Reggie's downstairs and he hears a crash and runs up. And this was something that I wanted to do in part 3. And so it's really like, you know, he gets thrown out of the hearse in part 2 and we pick it up with him and take it from there. So, yeah. Yes?
How much did the original one cost to make? How far over budget did you go? Were you having to do it real fast?
Well, actually, the budget was so low that rather than do it fast, we did it real slow. I mean, it was, must have taken us close to 3 years, actually, to do the film. We started shooting, and the budget was so low that we were just completely out of control. We just had to stop and edit it for a while, and I could get a feel for where the film was going. The ultimate budget on the film, I think we spent about somewhere in the vicinity of $300,000 was the cash cost in that film. Of course, everybody worked for it.
How much for the special effects as well?
The effects, I mean, I think they were very primitive, and obviously, and that, you know, when you don't have money, you got to make up for things with ingenuity, and that was one of the great parts of making that film, the whole nature of it. The sphere, I think we had maybe 3 models constructed for that film, and I don't believe we spent less than $2,000, the man who created those 3 models. Now, in part 3, in The Lord of the Dead, I think there are something like 65 models of the sphere. So we really went to town in that regard, and I think you know, after this one, I think we'll back up on the sphere, so we got a lot of this one. Yeah.
What the hell are the spheres?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're gonna have to see part 3, because I think the answer of what's inside the spheres, that's what we went into, and some sort of the nature of the power and how they relate to the tall man and to Mike. You know, I got a lot of questions from part one that really didn't get addressed in part two about what was the relationship between Mike and the tall man. He had the tall man has some kind of interest in him, and that's something we really worked on in part three. So, yes?
What kind of release you're going to have on this yet?
No, it's still kind of up in the air. We've Universal funded the film and basically just guaranteed a video release on it, and we're still negotiating with them. But I still anticipate a theatrical release on the picture later this year. Yes?
I recall reading an interview with you at Fangoria where you said for part two, you cut the blood from the spheres the same way you did in part one. They were going to give you an X. For this time out, did you still try to cut it the same way, or did you not even bother?
No, I did try it, and unfortunately, I have to report that for the independent horror film, trying to go up against the MPAA, it's an impossible task. You just don't have any chance. I did everything that I could. I screened it again and again for the MPAA, and basically, I had a sequence that was shot for shot the same as part one. And I think what worked to our advantage, though, because they focused so much on this ball thing, was like going in there. The members of the MPAA ratings board knew that they were expecting something wild from the sphere, you know, it was going to kill somebody, drill them, and kill them. And so they were gunning for this one sequence. And consequently, we were able to get away with a lot of other stuff that they just let slide because we tried to keep it. Unfortunately, it didn't work. I took it to a complete arbitration panel where we had to go to this meeting where they screened the film before 9 members of the industry. I don't know where these people come from, but I mean, it's a completely 90% male, 90% white, and not any kind of a cross-section of the American population as far as I'm concerned. And I made a pretty good case, and I got an even vote. It was like 5-4, I think it was. I actually got one vote, but you need 2/3. It's all rigged against the independent. And it's really frustrating because when the first Phantasm came out, there was this resurgence in the horror genre, and there was a lot of really interesting things coming out. And now you're just starting to see the censorship, rather than any of the distributors fighting the censorship, they accede to it, and you go to the foreign film markets and things, and they're saying, oh, well, we don't touch horror, or we don't do horror. It's become like a dirty word, and I really feel bad about that, because, not that I don't think you have to be responsible for your use of violence and blood, but I think at the same time, you should have the opportunity to express yourself, and I really feel that a lot of people are being muzzled in this country, and that's very frustrating. Yes, over there.
You brought back Bill Thornbury and the original Mike Jody back in this film.
Yes.
What is the story? Why was Mike not in Phantasm 2, and what was he doing at the time, and how did he get to come back in the third season or the second season?
Well, after we did Phantasm 1, Mike pretty much decided to not pursue an acting career. He was a pretty sharp guy. And I don't think he wanted to put himself through the abuse, especially at a young age. When the film finally came out, he was about 15. He did a little of the interviewing process, and I think he realized that this was not, a life for him, which I applauded him for that. When I was approached with the possibility to do Phantasm 2, in some ways, I had to sell myself to the devil a little bit in getting involved with Universal Pictures. And their people had very definite ideas about how to market the film. And one of these was the question of casting. And so I was essentially given a challenge, if you will, that if I wanted to make the film, that I could have Mike Baldwin as Mike, or I could have Reggie Bannister as Reggie, but not both. And so these poor guys had to actually screen test for Phantasm 2. We all know they can act. I know they can act, but the powers that be didn't. So I humiliated them and put them through the screen test, and at the same time I had to look to a lot of different actors for these roles. Now, obviously, if you're going to look at those two characters of Mike and Reggie, it's going to be a lot easier to recast Mike than to find a Reggie, because I can't tell you how ridiculous it was. You know, these casting calls went out for, you know, every bald man in Hollywood came in and started reading, and I was just ridiculous. And I basically had to decide which one it was going to be. And I, to this day, felt a responsibility to Michael for being left out of part 2. Now, this is not to say that the fellow that we cast for part 2 is a wonderful actor. His name's James LeGros. He's done some great roles since that time. And I expect him to be a big star in Hollywood eventually. And he did a fine job in the film, and I think it works okay. But to me, this was very frustrating. So, in approaching part 3, I determined that if I was going to do it, I was going to do it under my own terms, especially in terms of the casting. And so I was able to bring back Mike into the series, and through some tricks in the way we open up the beginning, he actually jumps right into the back of the hearse with James, where James was, and takes the story on from there. So that's pretty much the story of Mike. Yes?
I think I'm in trouble. I buy videos for a rental video outlet, and I was able to acquire a couple of Japanese prints of Phantasm. They call it Phantasm 3, that's all it was.
Oh.
But this is the first time that I've heard of domestic release on this. Legal complications of that.
Well, it sounds like...
By the time you come out with the domestic release,
I don't think you have a problem. I mean, I'm not going to chase after you, and I won't tell anybody, so your secret is safe. I don't think there'll be a problem, but I think what we can determine is if anybody wants to get an advanced showing of Phantasm 3 a la Phantasm Lord of the Dead, find out where this video store is, and you can rent it there. Although I don't know if they did they dub it in Japanese?
so what they did is they just left it straight. You don't like the dub. You have to like the dub. They subtitle everything under Japanese direction.
Oh, cool.
Language, but it's Japanese subtitle.
Oh, great.
You can find out what the characters look like for yeah.
Oh, that's great. All right. Cool. Yes, in the back.
Do you feel that work for Universal made the studio back of you? The MPAA apology would have hit you even harder.
Oh, I think there's no question about that on part 2. That there wasn't. We got away with some stuff because there were some big shots who did make some phone calls for us. But I really think that where that comes into play is when a studio has one of their, they call them their tentpole release for the summer, and where basically the finances of the company are riding on it, they can get the rating they want. And if it's one of their other releases, they'll still step on it a little bit, especially knowing, you know, and I think the problem that you've got is that horror just is going to get, if it's in the horror genre, tagged in the horror genre, you're going to get stepped on by the MPAA. And that's all there is really to it. You know, there are some reasonable people there in this organization that I've dealt with. The woman who I think is taking over for Mr. Hefner seems pretty responsible and reasonable, but it's the nature of the way this whole thing is built. Because my opinion is that there's a reason why there are these R ratings and why there are these X ratings. The R rating really gives the motion picture companies a license to let the theater owners be lax and let the kids get in and see the movies. So they like it that way. But the problem is if something's a hard R rating, this creates problems because the kids get in and see it, and that's where they're really clamming down, I believe. Humble opinion. Any other questions there? Yes?
You also directed The Beastmaster. How do you explain its phenomenal success years later? It's shown on the Turner channels all the time.
No, it's maybe to its detriment. I don't know. You could say, well, there's a lot of beefcake, and no, it covers all the bases. I mean, my intention when I was making that film was to make a film for kids, exciting sword and sorcery adventure, and
Tanya Roberts' name.
Yeah, well, yeah. So I guess she's part of it too. I mean, now that the farther she gets from Charlie's Angels, I guess people find her even more appealing. But the film has, it has a lot going for it. A lot of it's something the whole family can watch. Like I said, There's action and adventure, a little horror and a little sci-fi, and some humor, some unintentional humor. Any other questions out there? Yes?
I was wondering, the two projects, did you do two projects before Phantasm? The initial, I know you did Kenny and Company.
Yeah, that was, and prior to that I did a film called Jim the World's Greatest, which for the trivia buffs out there has a supporting role by an actor named Lawrence Guy, who a few years later changed his name to Angus Scrimm. And which is an interesting story, I'll tell you, about how I cast Angus in the Phantasm series. He was in this Jim the World's Greatest, and this film we made for about $70,000. And he was working for nothing, and we'd have him out to, when we were filming, he would have to wait back in his dressing room, and we were so unorganized, a lot of times he would come out and spend like 12 or 14 hours waiting, and we wouldn't shoot. And so it was my job to go back and tell him that we weren't going to work that day. And I always found him to be kind of an imposing, intimidating character. And so I determined that after that film that I'd put him in a pirate movie or a horror film. And I did. Any other questions? Yes? Nothing that's filmed yet. You know, I have some screenplays that I've written. I'm hoping that the next film I'll be doing will be in the genre. It's called The Boy Next Door, and it's got a, you know, I guess the genre you put it in would be maybe sort of a bad seed type of thing. Only this kid's really bad. Yes. You know, honestly, I would love to do another one if I could get the kind of money to really do something special. You know, the problem is that you know, I don't want to do the same thing again and again, tell the same story, and I think there are some elements that I have not covered in any of these. So yeah, I'd be looking to do one if you know, we get the proper budget. Any other questions out there? Yes, back there. Oh, I would have to say that my heart belongs to Phantasm 1 because it was a film that I made to scare people, and I believe it did, and I still enjoy watching it to this day. I met a lot of friends while making it who are still friends of mine, and it was kind of felt like a family making it. So yeah, the Phantasm 1 will always be the most special. As far as my favorite horror films, I like them all. I mean, when I was a kid here in Los Angeles, we had a lot of great TV shows. I don't know if any of you used to watch this. Chiller was on every Saturday night, and you know, the babysitter would come in, and my mother would say, "Don't let him watch that Chiller," you know, and she'd go off and talk to her boyfriend on the phone, and I'd get to watch those shows, and I loved it. You know, you can see a lot of some of my favorite stories and influences in the first Phantasm, I think. One of my favorite pictures was that Invaders from Mars. You see elements of that in Phantasm, some elements from books, and a little Something Wicked This Way Comes is in it also. Well, looks like I've answered all the questions there are about Phantasm. One more, yes?
Your first film was called The World's Greatest.
Yeah, that was the title.
How long after high school did you do that?
It was about 2 years, and I went to UCLA for a year, and I wanted to get into the film department, but they didn't allow anybody in there. You had to go there, I think, 3 years so you could get in, and I wanted to make a film, and I convinced my father to have a good year in the stock market to put up about $20,000, and we started shooting, and by the time we were almost done, I think we were in debt up to about, like I said, about $70,000, and he was going nuts. And the LA Times film critic, Charles Champlin, we showed it to him, because my father kept calling this guy up and saying, you know, my kid made this movie, what do I do with it? And so Champlin looked at it, and the next day he happened to have lunch with the president of Universal Pictures, and he said, this film, you should look at it, and Universal picked it up. And my dad got about double or triple his money back, so it worked out great. So I was going from there. Yes?
Sort of, well, the independent horror film has really suffered in the last 15 years because of the live small theater chains across America thriving as well.
believe it's terrible. And I really feel for the filmmakers and the want-to-be filmmakers out there who are looking to make their first feature. In the period when the first Phantasm came out, you could make a lower budgeted film, and there were a number of sources as to how to distribute it, and all these have fallen by the wayside, from Yapco Embassy to there's De Laurentiis, Atlantic Releasing. A lot of these companies just are gone. And there's some good news, of course, with Miramax and their Dimension Pictures is coming back. They're doing things that, obviously the problem, a lot of these things are out of the control of these distributors, because the costs of marketing a film are so high. To go nationwide with a picture, you've got to have at the least $4 to $5 million investment, which is a huge investment, which they just can't, a lot of them justify on something that's untried, unless it's a sequel. And I find it to be really terrible. I do believe, though, not trying to jump on this information highway bandwagon, but I believe that that soon that this will open up a lot of new markets for new filmmakers, because I believe that ultimately people will be able to make movies on their desktops. Everyone will be able to, and you'll have a completely free interchange through the computer networks. And this, I think, will be wonderful and liberating in a lot of ways. But as far as theatrical release, I really don't know what to say, because on the one hand, you want to try one way to do it, which was sort of how I did it, and friends of mine have done it since, is to make films that have something outrageous, violence-wise, to sell your film, which happened with Phantasm. Most recently happened with with Quentin and his Reservoir Dogs. But it's like even that sort of thing you're going to see, I'm afraid is going to be censored. And also with the censorship issue, you think it's bad here domestically, it's terrible overseas. I mean, Phantasm has never played in Scandinavia. It may not play this new one in the United Kingdom, and you start taking away these markets, and then you can't justify the making of the film. So that part of it's really frustrating. But it's a good question. Okay, last question. Who wants to be the last question? Huh? Doesn't look like we have it. Yes.
Mark Shortman did the effects on too, right?
Yes.
He did the effects on the
Mark did the makeup effects on part 3 also, and he did an excellent job. It was one of the things that we hadn't explored in the earlier Phantasms was zombies. We got a couple of them in here. It was something that I always wanted to try. The Walking Dead appealed to me, and he did a great job with that with his partner Dean Gates. And the fellow who did the sphere effects on Phantasm 3 is a fellow named Kerry Pryor, and he did a great job of some really incredible incarnations of the ball, which I look forward to you guys all seeing. Well, thanks a lot, everybody.
Let's do it again for Don Coscarelli.